If you don't apply a gender lens to policy development, then outcomes without that gender lens in so many areas will favour men. And those outcomes are not just bad for women in terms of the economy. Those outcomes without that, every economist will tell you that if you don't apply that lens and don't get a better outcome for women, not just women suffer, we all do. We all do, regardless of gender. And that's why affirmative action and policies that change the balance, that recognise that there is a power imbalance in society, are so important. That's why Labor has been so much more successful. When you look at the shadow cabinet that I have the great honour of chairing, with 50% of that shadow cabinet being made up of women, is because of that conscious decision, not just letting things flow and hoping that you get good outcomes. Susan Ryan understood that. She not only made a difference in specifics, she also understood that if you changed education so that more people finished high school, that would produce good outcomes for women, in particular down the track. So that she was particularly proud of lifting up, during her period as the Education Minister, the doubling of the number of girls who finished high school. She also went on to be, of course, look at age discrimination, disability discrimination, and to promote human rights. She did that for all, but with a particular focus, of course, inevitably, on women because of the discrimination that we know is there today. We know that the fastest growing cohort of homeless in Australia today is older women. We know that too many women are in circumstances whereby they are scared that because of violence or because of unemployment, they will find themselves homeless as well. These things need specific strategies. They don't just fix themselves. And in the budget on Tuesday night, we had 51% of our population left behind, just forgotten. How it is that you can produce a budget with $1 trillion debt, with a $215 billion deficit, with money, it seems, for unlimited in terms of going out the door, and not have initiatives directed particularly to address the fact that it is women who have particularly suffered under the Morrison recession. It is women, more so than men, who lost their jobs initially because they're in casual employment, because they have less security in that employment. And yet Tuesday's budget provided no focus to any of that. We know from talking to people in our electorate and people we know that before the pandemic, childcare fees were skyrocketing. We have some of the highest fees in the world. We know that women still earn less than men. We know that they retire with superannuation balances that are on average 47% less than men. What's the government's solution to that? Encourage a rate on superannuation for people who are desperate to get by and put food on the table, so that of the 600,000 Australians who have superannuation balances of zero as a result of this government's neglect and abandonment of people who needed support, a majority of those are women. Contrary to the government's narrative, the idea that all was rosy until the pandemic hit is just not right. But since the pandemic, of course, we know that since March, almost 200,000 women have lost their jobs, and 110,000 women have left the labour force altogether. That is, they're not actually even looking for work. At the peak of the restrictions earlier this year, more than 1 million women had no work whatsoever. Over 1 million women withdrew $14.4 billion from their super accounts as of the 4th of August. And when the government had to make a decision of where they would withdraw wage subsidies, it is beyond comprehension that the first group they chose were early childhood educators. The first group that were targeted for the withdrawal of that support. The pressures of lockdown, including remote learning, have had a disproportionate impact on women. As the primary providers of care, women have come under intense pressure during COVID, and they've not been supported by this government. We know that providers of emergency services, about domestic violence and others, have recorded record numbers of people needing that support. So you would have thought that in this budget there would be something. A women's workforce participation plan would have been a reasonable thing to expect. But what we have, of course, is from this government is a plan for a pink recession and a blue recovery, one that is simply not good enough. But we also have circumstances whereby when the government looks at these issues, when they've been raised, I could barely comprehend that the answers from the Prime Minister in question time yesterday about where the support was for women came up with, well, women want safe roads and they can drive on them too. It was only outdone, of course, by his answer earlier this year that in response to a question about the need for maternity support at Yass Hospital, he pointed out that he was going to put in an extra lane on the Barton Highway. The world's first announcement of a birthing lane was his response. But they just don't get it when you have statements like that. You had the roads position, it's got to be said, to be fair, to be gender neutral, backed up by Anne Ruston today on radio. You had the industry minister speak about apprenticeships and have no answer to the fact that what she was actually talking about was would overwhelmingly not assist women. And if you're over 35 and female, you'll be doing it even tougher because your wage subsidy's just been cut. Your wage subsidy will disappear in March. You'll be back on unemployment benefits of $40 a day, being driven into poverty. And you'll have to compete for work with people who are eligible for a wage subsidy and wage support. So an employer, common sense, will tell you if you have two people, one with support, one with not, which one will you go to? Where will the outcome be? And we're supportive of support. We just say, stop leaving people behind. Stop leaving people out of your solutions. So the fact is that in terms of this budget, I think that these events that Labor's held every year since the Women's Budget Statement was abolished by this government, and remember that Tony Abbott was the Minister for Women in his own government, bizarrely. But of course, he only had one woman in the cabinet, and he said that was regrettable. But they're not elected, like he appointed them. He appointed them. It wasn't like our process. Since then, we've had these events and women's budget statements. And a government I lead, in the budget after next, will return to having a women's budget statement. Because if you had that, if you were producing it, maybe someone in the last few weeks and months would have gone, oh, hang on, what are we going to put in the women's budget statement? Do you reckon we should have something to say other than cuts and leaving people out? I reckon they probably would. That's why structures matter. That's why rules matter. I reckon that if Jim Chalmers, as the Shadow Treasurer and future Treasurer, came into our show in a cabinet with 50% women and said, here it is, he'd get knocked over. There wouldn't be a budget statement on Tuesday night. We'd have to defer and start again, because you just wouldn't do it. And the response of the government is to ring up people, a bloke of course, from the PMO, to ring up people and say, oh, no credible women support what you're saying, that women have been left out of the budget. It's a bit of a hashtag going, credible women, at the moment. I think that every Australian is credible. Every Australian, every woman and every man. And I also think that we have some incredible women as part of the team that I have the great honour of leading, including Penny Wong and Christina Keneally as part of my leadership team. Katie Gallagher, the whole team is just extraordinary, and we will make an absolute difference.